I needed a break from life, something to pull me out of the dark spiral I'd been falling into. I'd been battling this constant heaviness for months, years, maybe. My job felt like it was grinding me down to dust, and every time I tried to find some light in my personal life, it just fizzled out. It wasn't that anything catastrophic had happened. It was the endless monotony that made it hard to breathe. So I decided to get away. It was early spring in 2019 when I packed my car and headed north. I'd found a campsite online, tucked away in a forest about 4 hours from where I lived in Tennessee. The place was isolated, surrounded by thick woods, with a small lake nearby. It seemed perfect. The website promised quiet trails, clear night skies, and a chance to disconnect. That's what I needed. No phone, no emails, no one asking me for anything. Just me and the woods. I didn't tell many people about my plans. A few coworkers knew I'd be off the grid for the week, and I mentioned it to my parents in passing. But that was it. I wasn't running from anyone. I just wanted to be left alone. The drive up was uneventful, though the last stretch of road leading to the campsite was rough. It was a narrow dirt road, winding through miles of trees. The deeper I drove into the forest, the more I felt the outside world slipping away. The campsite was exactly as advertised. There were only a handful of spots, each spaced far enough apart that you couldn't see or hear your neighbors. I picked a spot near the edge of the forest, not far from the lake. It was beautiful. Tall pine trees surrounded the clearing, and the air smelled fresh and earthy. Birds chirped overhead, and the distant sound of water lapping against the shore was the only other noise. I set up my tent, unloaded my gear, and took a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of peace. The first day passed uneventfully. I hiked one of the shorter trails, cooked a simple meal over my camp stove, and sat by the lake as the sun dipped below the horizon. The quiet was almost unnerving at first, but I reminded myself that this was what I wanted, to escape the noise and chaos of everyday life. That night, I slept better than I had in months. The cool air, the soft rustle of leaves, and the distant hoot of an owl created a lullaby that pulled me into a deep, dreamless sleep. The second day, I decided to explore a longer trail. According to the map, it looped around the lake and cut through a dense section of forest before circling back. It was about 10 miles, which felt like a good challenge. The trail started off well-marked and easy to follow. The forest was alive with the sound of birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. About halfway through the loop, I noticed something odd. The trail, which had been clear and well-trodden, started to fade. At first, I thought I'd just missed a marker, but as I retraced my steps, I couldn't find any signs pointing me in the right direction. I checked my map, but it was little help. It was a simple, hand-drawn thing I'd printed off the campsite's website, and it didn't include much detail. I decided to keep going in what I thought was the right direction, figuring the trail would reappear soon. Didn't. Instead, the trees grew thicker, and the underbrush became harder to navigate. Every step felt like an effort as I pushed through thorny bushes and low-hanging branches. The forest was completely silent now. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves. I stopped to catch my breath and realized I wasn't sure which way I'd come from. The trees all looked the same, and there were no landmarks to orient myself. I turned in a slow circle, hoping to catch a glimpse of the lake or the trail, but there was nothing. That's when I felt it, the first prick of unease. I told myself to stay calm. I'd been hiking for years and had gotten turned around before. As long as I kept moving in a straight line, I'd eventually hit the lake or the trail. I picked a direction and started walking, marking trees with small scratches from my pocket knife to keep track of where I'd been. An hour passed, then another. The forest seemed endless, stretching out in every direction with no sign of the lake or the campsite. My water bottle was half empty, and I hadn't seen any streams to refill it. The unease grew into something heavier. It wasn't just being lost. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, I brushed it off as paranoia. The isolation was playing tricks on my mind, making me jump at shadows and see movement where there was none. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it grew stronger with every step I took. I started to notice small things, broken branches that seemed too fresh, footprints in the dirt that didn't match mine. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but they were there. I wasn't alone. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. My legs ached, and my throat was dry. I decided to stop and rest for a few minutes, sitting on a fallen log. The forest was still eerily quiet, but I was too tired to care. That's when I saw it. About 20 feet away, hidden in the shadows of the trees, was something that didn't belong. It was a small clearing, and in the center was a pile of objects. Rusted cans, torn pieces of clothing, and what looked like old camping gear. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The pile was larger than it had seemed at first, and as I got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A pair of hiking boots, worn and covered in mud, sitting neatly next to the pile. They were too clean to have been there long. I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming at me to leave. I didn't know who or what had left that pile, but I didn't want to find out. The sun was starting to set, and the shadows stretched long and thin across the forest floor. I needed to find my way back before dark. I picked up my pace, ignoring the burning in my legs and the ache in my chest. The feeling of being watched was unbearable now. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something following me, but there was nothing, just trees. As the light faded, I spotted something through the trees, a structure. Relief flooded through me as I stumbled toward it, thinking I'd found a ranger station or another camper's site. But as I got closer, my relief turned to dread. It wasn't a campsite. It was a small, dilapidated cabin, half hidden by overgrown bushes. The windows were broken, and the door hung slightly ajar. I didn't want to go inside, but the darkness was closing in, and I didn't have much choice. I pushed the door open cautiously, the hinges groaning loudly in the silence. The interior was worse than the outside. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, and the air smelled damp and musty. There was no furniture, just a few broken boards and an old, rusted stove in the corner. I didn't feel safe, but it was better than being out in the open. I barricaded the door as best as I could with some of the loose boards and huddled in a corner, clutching my pocket knife. The night was long and terrifying. Every sound outside the cabin made me jump. I thought I heard footsteps at one point, but when I peeked out through a crack in the wall, there was nothing there. I didn't sleep. At first light, I left the cabin and started walking again. My only goal was to get out of the forest. I didn't care which direction I went as long as it led me to civilization. Hours passed, and my hope began to fade. The forest seemed endless, and my energy was running out. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I heard it, the faint sound of a car engine. I followed the sound desperately, stumbling through the trees until I burst out onto a narrow dirt road. A truck was parked a few yards away, and a man was loading something into the back. He looked up as I approached, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. I told him I was lost, and he offered me a ride back to the main road. As I climbed into the truck, I glanced back at the forest. It was silent, the trees standing like sentinels, hiding whatever secrets they held. I never went back to that campsite, and I never found out who or what had been in the forest with me. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about that cabin and the pile of belongings. I dream about the footprints and the feeling of being watched. And when I wake up, I can't shake the feeling that I was lucky to make it out. It had been a tough year. Losing my wife, her sister, and their mom in quick succession left me in a haze. Grief felt like a thick fog that clung to me no matter what I did. I didn't know how to move forward, so I just kept going through the motions, pretending I had it together when I didn't. One day, I came across an old photo of all of us camping in the woods. It was from years ago when things were still good. We were smiling, gathered around a small fire. I remembered how much my wife loved those trips, how her sister would tease her about always burning the marshmallows, and how their mom would insist on bringing the heaviest cast iron skillet, claiming it made the best campfire breakfasts. That photo hit me hard, but it also sparked an idea. Maybe going back to the woods could help me feel closer to them, even if just for a little while. I decided to head to a spot we'd camped at before, somewhere remote in the Adirondacks. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing we'd found by accident one year. It was perfect. A stream nearby for water, tall trees for shade, and a view of the mountains if you climbed the ridge. I figured a few days out there, away from everything, might give me some clarity or, at the very least, some peace. I packed lightly, just the essentials. A tent, sleeping bag, some food, a small stove, and a few other odds and ends. I left my phone in the car. There wouldn't be service anyway, and I didn't want the distraction. As I drove out to the trailhead, the familiar winding roads brought back memories. It was strange how certain places could feel exactly the same even when everything else had changed. The hike to the campsite was harder than I remembered. Maybe it was because I was older now, or maybe I just wasn't in as good shape. Either way, the weight of my pack dug into my shoulders, and my legs burned as I climbed the final hill. But when I reached the clearing, it was worth it. The place looked almost untouched, like no one had been there since the last time we camped. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, where the ground was flattest. The stream was still there, its water clear and cold. I filled my bottle and sat for a while, listening to the gentle rush of the current. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. As the sun dipped lower, I started a fire. I'd brought a small bundle of firewood in case I couldn't find any dry wood nearby, but the forest was generous. Twigs and branches littered the ground, and I had a decent pile going in no time. I cooked a simple dinner, just some noodles and canned chicken, but it was enough. Eating by the fire, with the stars starting to peek out overhead, I felt a little of the weight I'd been carrying start to lift. That night, though, I barely slept. The forest was alive with sounds. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. Normally, those sounds would have been comforting, a reminder that I wasn't alone out there. But something about them felt off. It wasn't just the sounds themselves. It was the pauses between them. They were too long, too deliberate, like the forest was holding its breath. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that I wasn't used to being out here alone. But even after I crawled into my sleeping bag and zipped the tent shut, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I woke up groggy and stiff. I made coffee and forced myself to eat a granola bar. I tried to shake off the unease from the night before, telling myself it was all in my head. After breakfast, I decided to explore the area. There was a ridge nearby that offered a great view of the valley, and I figured the hike up there would do me good. The trail to the ridge was overgrown but still passable. As I climbed, I noticed little things that seemed wrong. A tree with deep claw marks in its bark. A pile of rocks that looked like they'd been deliberately stacked. A faint, sour smell that I couldn't place. Each thing on its own wasn't too alarming, but together, they set me on edge. When I reached the top of the ridge, The view was as breathtaking as I remembered. The valley stretched out below, the trees a sea of green that seemed to go on forever. But even up there, with the sun shining and the wind in my face, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. On the way back to camp, I started noticing more strange things. Twigs snapped in the distance, but when I turned to look, nothing was there. Once, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, it was just shadows. Back at camp, I tried to focus on staying busy. I gathered more firewood, boiled water from the stream, and double-checked my gear. But the sense of unease only grew. By the time the sun started to set, I was jumpy, every little sound making me flinch. That night, the forest was quieter than before. The usual sounds, owls, crickets, the wind, were gone. It was so silent that I could hear my own heartbeat. I stayed up by the fire as long as I could, staring into the flames and trying to convince myself I was just imagining things. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I crawled into my tent. I don't know what woke me, a sound maybe, or a feeling. But when I opened my eyes, I knew something was wrong. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the clearing. My tent felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. I stayed still, listening, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my heart. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps just outside the tent. I froze. The sound was too close, too deliberate to be an animal. Whoever it was, they were circling the tent, slow and steady. My mind raced. I thought about grabbing the knife I'd packed, but it was in my bag by the fire. I was completely unarmed. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the zipper of the tent began to move. Panic took over. I scrambled out of the tent through the other side, my hands shaking so badly I could barely undo the zipper. I ran toward the car, not caring about the gear I was leaving behind. The woods closed in around me, the trees looming like dark giants. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my legs burned, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, dropping them twice before I managed to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I peeled out of the parking area, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It wasn't until I was back in my apartment, every door locked and every light on, that I let myself breathe. I never went back to that campsite. I don't know who or what was out there, but I do know one thing. I wasn't alone, and I never will be again. Every time I close my eyes, I see that figure standing in the shadows, waiting. It was late September, and the air had started to cool down, signaling the beginning of autumn. I decided to take a weekend off from my usual patrols as a cop and head out to the woods for a bit of solitude. My work as an officer in a small Midwest town had been stressful lately. Too many calls, too many long nights, and not enough time to clear my head. The idea of camping alone, away from the noise and tension, seemed like the perfect way to reset. I picked a spot about 2 hours away from town, a secluded area within the expansive Pine Ridge Forest. It wasn't a popular camping site, which was exactly why I chose it. I'd been there a couple of times before and knew it had little traffic from hikers or other campers. It felt private, untouched, and peaceful. I arrived just before sunset, parking my truck at the edge of a dirt path that led into the forest. I loaded up my pack with the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a flashlight, and, of course, my off-duty firearm. Being a cop, I was naturally cautious, and I wasn't about to camp out in the middle of nowhere without protection. The woods might have been quiet, but you never knew what or who might show up. As I hiked deeper into the forest, the tall pines towered over me, their shadows stretching across the trail. The air smelled crisp, a mix of pine and damp earth. After about an hour, I found a clearing that seemed perfect. It was flat, with enough open space for my tent, but still surrounded by dense trees for some cover. There was even a small fire ring left by previous campers. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal of canned chili and crackers, listening to the faint sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was exactly what I needed. By the time I crawled into my tent and zipped up my sleeping bag, I felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke up early. The forest was quiet, with only the soft chirping of birds breaking the stillness. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. I left most of my gear at the campsite, taking only my water bottle, a small first aid kit, and my firearm. I wandered through the woods for hours, following deer trails and soaking in the solitude. By the time I returned to the campsite, it was late afternoon, and the sun was starting to sink lower in the sky. That's when I noticed something odd. The fire ring, which I had left cold and untouched that morning, now had fresh ash and charred wood in it. It wasn't much, but it was enough to tell me someone else had been there while I was gone. My heart rate picked up as I scanned the area, looking for any other signs of disturbance. Nothing else seemed out of place. My tent was untouched, and my gear was still where I'd left it. I tried to shake off the unease. Maybe a hunter or another camper had stumbled upon the site, used the fire ring, and moved on. It wasn't that unusual. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows among the trees seemed darker, the rustling of leaves sharper. As night fell, I built another fire and sat close to it, my back to the tent. I kept my flashlight and firearm within arm's reach. Every now and then, I'd scan the tree line with the light, but all I saw were the same tall pines and thick underbrush. The forest felt heavier that night, the usual nighttime sounds drowned out by an oppressive silence. I didn't sleep much. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves jolted me awake, my hand instinctively reaching for my weapon. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted but relieved to see the sunlight creeping through the trees. I decided I'd had enough of camping for one weekend and started packing up my gear. As I was taking down the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the soft dirt around the campsite were footprints. Large, heavy prints that didn't match my boots. They circled the tent and led off into the woods. Whoever had been at the fire ring yesterday hadn't just passed through. They'd been watching me. I finished packing in record time, shoving my gear into my backpack and extinguishing the fire. I didn't bother with breakfast. My only goal was to get back to my truck and leave. The hike back felt longer than it should have, every step accompanied by the nagging sensation that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the woods were empty, or at least they looked that way. When I finally reached the dirt road where I'd parked, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. My truck was still there, untouched. I threw my pack into the bed, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I didn't see anything in my rearview mirror, but that didn't mean much. The dirt road was surrounded by thick forest, and anyone or anything could have been hidden in the trees. I didn't feel safe until I was back on the highway, the open road stretching out before me. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints and the fire ring. I replayed the weekend in my head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it was another camper who didn't mean any harm. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Someone had been out there watching me, waiting, I never went back to Pine Ridge Forest. Whatever or whoever had been out there that weekend had left a mark on me. Even now, years later, I still find myself looking over my shoulder when I'm alone, haunted by the thought of unseen eyes in the woods. I've worked as a woodsman for nearly 8 years. It's not an easy job, but it's a job I've grown to love. I work for a timber company, cutting and hauling trees, maintaining trails, and surveying forested areas for potential logging sites. My boss, George, isn't exactly the warmest guy, but he knows the work. He's gruff, all business, and not one to sugarcoat anything. He gives assignments and you take them without question. That's how it's always been. It was late October of 2019, and George called me into his office. He tossed a map onto his desk, pointing to a remote area of forest I'd never been to before. This place needs to be scouted. We're considering expanding our operations there, he said flatly. I scanned the map, recognizing the general region. It was deep in the Pacific Northwest, far from any towns or well-traveled roads. The area was marked with steep ridges, dense forests, and very little in the way of landmarks. I nodded, not wanting to show any hesitation. Take a week. Camp if you have to. We need a detailed report on what's out there, George said before dismissing me. The next morning, I loaded up my truck with gear, tent, sleeping bag, tools, enough food and water for a week, and a GPS device. I checked the weather forecast, which called for rain and colder temperatures as the week progressed. I wasn't thrilled about that, but it wasn't anything I hadn't dealt with before. The drive to the area took nearly 6 hours. The last 2 hours were on unpaved logging roads, the kind where you feel every bump and pothole. Eventually, I reached the spot where the road ended. From there, I'd be on foot. I parked the truck, grabbed my gear, and set off into the woods. The forest was dense, the kind where sunlight barely reaches the ground. The air was damp, filled with the smell of moss and decaying leaves. It was quiet, aside from the occasional rustle of leaves or distant bird calls. I hiked for several hours before finding a suitable spot to set up camp, a small clearing near a stream. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and ate a quick meal. By the time I finished, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. The first night was uneventful. I lay in my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made my heart race, but I told myself it was just the normal sounds of the woods. The next day, I started surveying the area, marking trees and taking notes. The forest felt different here. It was quieter than I was used to, almost unnervingly so. Around midday, I stumbled across something odd. A makeshift shelter, crudely built from branches and a torn tarp. It looked abandoned, but it wasn't old. There were empty food cans scattered around and a small fire pit. I felt uneasy but chalked it up to a hunter or someone passing through. I moved on, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sensation didn't leave me for the rest of the day. That night, I woke up to the sound of movement outside my tent. It was faint, but unmistakable, slow, deliberate footsteps. I held my breath, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment, there was silence. Then I heard it again, this time closer. I reached for the hatchet I kept by my side, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I decided to push deeper into the forest, hoping to finish my work quickly so I could leave. I kept looking over my shoulder, the feeling of being watched stronger than ever. In the afternoon, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was another shelter, but this one was different. It was larger, more structured, and clearly not abandoned. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, and hanging from a tree branch was a string of what looked like animal bones. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I marked the location on my map and headed back toward my camp, moving as quickly as I could. That night, the rain started. It was a light drizzle at first, but it quickly turned into a downpour. My tent leaked, and the cold seeped through my sleeping bag. I couldn't stop shivering. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. They were louder this time, circling my tent. My mind raced with possibilities: an animal, a person, something worse. Then I heard a low, guttural sound, like a growl. It wasn't any animal I recognized. I gripped my hatchet tightly, every muscle in my body tense. The growling stopped, replaced by a strange clicking noise. I don't know how long it went on, but eventually, it stopped. I lay there in the dark, terrified to move. At first light, I packed up my gear and left. I didn't care about finishing the survey or reporting back to George. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to my truck was the longest of my life. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. When I finally reached the truck, I threw my gear in the back and sped down the logging road as fast as I could. I didn't tell George the full story when I returned. I simply said the area wasn't suitable for logging and handed him my incomplete notes. He didn't press for details. To this day, I don't know what was out there. Maybe it was just my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on me. Or maybe it was something else, something I don't want to understand. I've avoided that part of the forest ever since. Sometimes I still hear that clicking sound in my dreams, and every time, I wake up in a cold sweat. I'm not sure why I agreed to go camping with Alex. We had only known each other for about a year, meeting regularly at the gym. I wasn't much of an outdoors person, but Alex was always talking about hiking, camping, and surviving off the grid. His enthusiasm rubbed off on me, and before I knew it, I found myself saying yes when he suggested a weekend camping trip in the mountains. It was late October 2022 when we set out. The air was crisp, and the leaves had turned every shade of red and orange. We drove 3 hours from the city to a remote area in upstate New York. The plan was to park at the trailhead, hike about 8 miles into the woods, and camp near a secluded lake Alex knew about. It sounded straightforward enough, and Alex assured me he'd handle most of the planning. I packed what I could: a sleeping bag, some snacks, a flashlight, and warm clothes. Alex brought the tent, cooking gear, and the maps. When we arrived, the parking lot at the trailhead was empty, which didn't surprise me. It was the off-season for campers, and the area wasn't particularly well known. That's what Alex liked about it. Quiet, untouched, and far from any crowds. I wasn't thrilled about being so isolated, but I told myself it would be an adventure. The first few hours of the hike were uneventful. The trail was well marked, and the weather was perfect. Alex kept up a steady pace, occasionally pointing out animal tracks or interesting plants. I tried to enjoy myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. There was something about the silence in the woods that felt unnatural. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our boots crunching on the trail. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, we reached the lake. It was beautiful, surrounded by dense forest, with the water so still it looked like a mirror. We found a flat spot a few hundred feet from the shore to set up camp. Alex pitched the tent while I gathered firewood. The process of setting up kept me busy, and for a while I forgot about my nerves. We built a fire, cooked some freeze-dried meals, and sat by the flames as the sky turned dark. The stars were out in full force, and the moon cast a silver glow over the lake. It was peaceful, and I started to feel like maybe this wasn't such a bad idea after all. Alex talked about his plans to tackle longer trails next year, and I mostly just listened, nodding along. Around 10 p.m., we decided to call it a night. The fire was dying down, and the temperature had dropped significantly. We climbed into the tent, zipped up our sleeping bags, and settled in. I drifted off to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. I woke up to a sound I couldn't immediately identify. It was faint but persistent, like something scraping against a hard surface. I lay there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just an animal rummaging around outside. I didn't want to wake Alex, so I stayed still, straining my ears. The noise grew louder, and now it sounded like footsteps crunching on the forest floor. Slow, deliberate steps circling our campsite. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a deer or a raccoon. It was something larger. Someone. I reached over and nudged Alex, who woke up groggily. He must have seen the look on my face because he didn't say a word. We both listened, frozen in place. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. Then the sound of heavy breathing. My mind raced. Was it a hiker who had lost their way? A park ranger checking on us? But why would they come in the middle of the night without announcing themselves? Alex gestured for me to stay quiet. He unzipped the tent as slowly as possible, just enough to peek outside. I held my breath, waiting for his reaction. He turned back to me, his face pale, and whispered, "There's no one there." We sat in silence for what felt like hours, too scared to move. The footsteps started again, this time heading toward the lake. Alex finally grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the tent. I followed reluctantly, holding a small camping knife I had brought with me. The air was icy, and the forest was pitch black except for the narrow beam of Alex's flashlight. We scanned the area, but there was no sign of anyone. No footprints in the dirt, no rustling in the bushes. The only sound was the faint lapping of water against the shore. I felt a knot of dread tighten in my stomach. Alex muttered something about it probably being an animal, but I could tell he didn't believe it any more than I did. We decided to stoke the fire and stay up for the rest of the night. Sitting by the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. Alex tried to keep things light, cracking jokes and talking about how great the hike back would be in the morning. But I could see the tension in his face. Around 3 a.m., just as I was starting to feel a little calmer, we heard it again. Footsteps, this time faster, moving through the woods toward us. Alex grabbed a branch from the fire, holding it like a torch, while I stood frozen. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. Then, out of nowhere, a rock came flying out of the darkness, landing just a few feet from the fire. Another one followed, hitting the edge of the tent. I grabbed Alex's arm, my voice trembling as I said, "We need to leave, now." He didn't argue. We hurriedly packed up what we could, leaving behind the tent and anything too bulky to carry. With our flashlights cutting through the darkness, we started back down the trail. Every few minutes, we stopped to listen, but the footsteps didn't follow. The only sounds were our labored breathing and the crunch of leaves underfoot. By the time we reached the trailhead, the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. We threw our gear into the car and drove off without looking back. Neither of us spoke the entire way home. It's been months since that trip, and I still don't know what happened that night. Alex and I never talked about it again, and I stopped going to the gym shortly after. I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever or whatever was out there might have followed us back. All I know is that I'll never set foot in those woods again. Some places are better left unexplored. I've always been someone who enjoys solitude. As a kid, I loved the quiet moments sitting alone by the creek near our house, listening to the water trickle over smooth rocks. So, when I turned 28, I figured a solo camping trip would be the perfect way to disconnect from the stress of city life. The plan was simple: 3 days in the woods, completely off-grid. I chose a spot deep in the forests of Oregon, a place called Hartley Preserve. It wasn't a well-known campground, just miles of dense trees, a few marked trails, and a large lake in the middle. I'd read online that it was rarely crowded, and that's exactly what I wanted. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, and a first aid kit. I also brought my old hunting knife and a small hatchet, not because I expected trouble, but because they were standard items for anyone venturing into the wilderness. I arrived at the trailhead around noon on a Friday. The parking lot was almost empty, just one dusty pickup parked off to the side. I figured whoever it belonged to was already deep in the woods. Perfect. The fewer people around, the better. The hike to my chosen campsite was about 4 miles. The air was crisp, and the canopy above filtered the sunlight into soft, golden patches on the forest floor. It was the kind of peaceful that makes you forget the world exists. I reached the lake around 3 p.m. It was even more beautiful than I'd imagined. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the towering pines that surrounded it. I found a flat spot about 20 yards from the shore and set up my tent. By the time I'd gathered some firewood and got a small fire going, the sun was starting to set. The sky turned shades of pink and orange, and the lake mirrored it perfectly. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, ate in silence, and felt a calmness I hadn't felt in years. That night, I slept like a rock. The sounds of the forest, the chirping crickets, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, felt like a lullaby. But around 3 a.m., I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow inside the tent. I lay there, listening, trying to figure out what had disturbed me. Then I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves somewhere nearby. It wasn't unusual for animals to wander through campsites, so I didn't think much of it. Probably a raccoon or a deer. Still, I sat up and grabbed my flashlight. Shining it through the tent's mesh window, I scanned the trees. Nothing. The crunching stopped after a few minutes, and I figured whatever it was had moved on. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily after that. The next morning, I shook it off. Animals are part of the experience, I told myself. I made some coffee, ate a granola bar, and spent the day exploring the area. I hiked along the lake, fished for a bit, and even found a small waterfall tucked away behind a rocky outcrop. By the time I returned to camp, it was late afternoon. I cooked dinner over the fire again, watched the sunset, and felt that same peacefulness wash over me. That night, though, the unease returned. I woke up around the same time, 3 a.m., to the sound of movement. But this time, it wasn't faint. It was deliberate, heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I froze. The steps were slow, steady, and close. Too close. I reached for my flashlight and knife, my heart pounding. Shining the light through the mesh again, I saw nothing but trees and darkness. The footsteps stopped. I stayed awake for hours, clutching the knife and listening for any sound. But the forest was silent. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up my gear. I wasn't going to stay another night. Something felt wrong, and I wasn't about to ignore it. On the hike back, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the trail behind me was always empty. I reached the parking lot around noon. My car was the only one there. As I loaded my gear into the trunk, I noticed something odd. On the rear window, written in the dust, were the words, "Leave now." My stomach dropped. I hadn't noticed it when I arrived, and there was no way I would have missed something like that. I didn't stick around to investigate. I got in the car and drove as fast as I could. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but I haven't been camping since. Camping near the US-Mexico border wasn't part of the original plan. My buddy and I, both in our late 20s, were heading toward Arizona's southern border for a short road trip. The goal was to find some solitude, disconnect from the world, and camp under the stars for a few nights. It was mid-November, the days were warm, and the nights were cold but bearable. What we didn't plan for was ending up next to an old, forgotten graveyard. We had spent most of the day driving through rugged terrain, stopping occasionally to stretch our legs or take in the scenery. The landscape was barren, a mix of dry shrubs, scattered cacti, and rocky hills. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. As the sun started to set, we realized we'd misjudged our timing. We were miles away from any official campsite, and the nearest town was a good 2 hours behind us. Pulling off onto a dirt road, we decided to look for a flat spot to set up camp. The road twisted and turned, eventually leading us to a small clearing. It was flat, surrounded by tall mesquite trees, and seemed perfect until I noticed the crumbling headstones in the distance. At first, I thought it was just some rocks or old markers, but as we walked closer, it became clear that it was an abandoned graveyard. Most of the headstones were tilted or broken, and some were so worn down you couldn't read the names or dates. A rusted metal fence barely enclosed the area, and there was no sign of anyone having been there for years. I was hesitant, but my buddy brushed it off. "It's just an old graveyard," he said before reminding me we had no better options. The idea of spending the night so close to a burial site made my stomach turn, but the sun was already dipping below the horizon. The last thing I wanted was to drive in the dark and risk getting lost. We set up our tent a good distance from the graveyard, maybe 50 yards away, and built a small fire to keep warm. The flames cast long, flickering shadows on the trees, making the area feel even more isolated. The first few hours passed uneventfully. We cooked a simple dinner over the fire, listened to the quiet rustle of the wind through the trees, and gazed up at the stars. The graveyard was far enough away that it didn't feel like it was looming over us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding on something. Around midnight, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, unfamiliar smell, something earthy and metallic, like wet soil mixed with rust. It wasn't strong, but it was persistent, and it made me uneasy. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the fire, which had started to die down. That's when I heard the first sound. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it was there. A soft, crunching noise, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The sound came again, closer this time, and my heart started to race. We had seen no one for miles, and the idea of someone wandering out here in the middle of the night didn't sit right. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the direction of the sound, but the beam only revealed more trees and shadows. Probably an animal, I told myself, though the thought didn't comfort me much. As the hours dragged on, the noises didn't stop. They came in bursts, footsteps, a distant rustling, the occasional snap of a twig. Each time, I would shine my flashlight into the darkness, but I never saw anything. It was like the sounds were deliberately staying just out of reach. Eventually, I decided to lie down in the tent, hoping sleep would come despite the unease gnawing at my stomach. My buddy was already out cold, his soft snores blending with the ambient noise of the night. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the nylon ceiling of the tent, every muscle in my body tense. Then, just as I was beginning to drift off, a sharp metallic clang jolted me awake. It sounded like metal striking metal, coming from the direction of the graveyard. My blood ran cold as I sat up, listening intently. The sound came again, louder this time, and I could feel my chest tighten with fear. Grabbing my flashlight and a small pocket knife, I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and stepped outside. The fire was nearly out, just a faint glow of embers illuminating the campsite. The air was freezing, and that strange metallic smell was stronger now. I walked slowly toward the edge of the clearing, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The graveyard was barely visible, a shadowy cluster of stones and twisted metal fencing. I didn't want to get any closer, but something compelled me to keep moving. As I approached, I noticed something strange. The rusted gate, which had been hanging ajar earlier, was now swinging back and forth on its hinges, creaking softly. There was no wind strong enough to move it like that, and I felt my stomach drop. I shined my flashlight over the graveyard, and that's when I saw it. A fresh hole in the ground, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The dirt around it was loose, as if it had been recently dug up. My first thought was that it must have been an animal, a coyote or maybe a stray dog, but the hole was too clean, too deliberate. I took a step closer, my breath catching in my throat. The headstone next to the hole was one of the few that was still legible. It had a name I didn't recognize and a date that marked the grave as over a century old. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trunks, but it was gone before I could focus on it. Panic set in. I backed away from the graveyard, keeping my flashlight trained on the trees. The growling sound came again, louder this time, and I could feel the vibration in my chest. Whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It felt too deliberate, too calculated. I turned and ran back to the campsite, my heart pounding. My buddy was still asleep, oblivious to everything. I shook him awake, but he just groaned and rolled over, muttering something incoherent. The noises didn't stop. They circled the campsite, coming from all directions, as if something or someone was toying with us. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight and pocket knife, my eyes darting toward every sound. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the noises had stopped, and the metallic smell had faded. We packed up as quickly as we could, neither of us speaking much. As we drove away, I glanced back at the clearing. The graveyard was barely visible through the trees, but I could still see the gate swinging in the breeze and the fresh hole in the ground. We never spoke about it again. Whatever happened that night felt like something I wasn't supposed to understand, and I wasn't about to question it. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or heard, but one thing is certain: I'll never camp near a graveyard again. I had always liked camping. There was something about the wilderness, the quiet, and the crisp air that I could never get enough of. That weekend, I decided to go solo. I wanted peace and quiet, away from the noise of the world. I packed up my truck, grabbed my gear, and set out on a drive through the forest roads, heading for a secluded spot I'd found a few months earlier. It was late October, and the trees were nearly bare, with only a few stubborn leaves hanging on. The weather was cool, but not too cold, just enough for a cozy campfire. I found the spot just after sunset, a small clearing nestled between two large, thick pines. The ground was firm but uneven, so I pitched my tent quickly, not wasting any time as darkness started creeping in. The sun disappeared completely by the time I had the tent set up and a fire crackling. I wasn't planning on staying up too late, just a few hours to unwind before heading to bed. The flames danced, casting eerie shadows across the trees and making the surrounding woods seem almost alive. I was used to the sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, the occasional bird call, the wind. So I didn't think much of the soft, distant noises. But as the fire burned lower, I began hearing something different. It was faint, a crackling, like footsteps on dry leaves. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, moving around in the underbrush. But the sound was rhythmic, deliberate, not like an animal. I sat still, listening. The sound seemed to move closer, then stop, and then start again. It was almost like someone was circling my campsite. My heart rate picked up a bit, but I tried to calm myself. Could just be the wind, or another camper nearby, though I hadn't seen any other vehicles on the way in. I tried to focus on the fire, willing myself not to let the noise get to me. But it wasn't just the noise, it was the feeling, the sensation that I wasn't alone, that something was out there, and it wasn't just a casual passerby. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and scanned the edge of the clearing. Nothing, just trees. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The silence that followed felt thick, unnatural. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I waited, listening, and then there it was again, a crack, followed by a soft thud, like something or someone was stepping on the branches around the perimeter of my camp. This time I stood up. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it could be. A bear? A mountain lion? But the sounds were too methodical, too precise. Animals didn't move like that, at least not that I knew of. I took a deep breath and grabbed the knife I always kept on my belt when I was camping alone. It was a bit of an overreaction, but the thought of whatever it was circling my camp, getting closer, made my heart pound harder. Another thud. This time I couldn't ignore it. The footsteps were closer. I could almost hear them clearly, feel them vibrating in the earth beneath my boots. I made my way around the camp, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The fire crackled behind me, casting long shadows against the trees. The silence around me was so thick, I almost couldn't stand it. I crept toward the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark. I reached the edge of the clearing, shining the light into the dense brush and trees. Nothing. The only movement was the flicker of shadows from the fire. I almost convinced myself it was nothing, that maybe I was just jumpy. But then, a branch snapped in the distance. I froze. This time, it wasn't just a noise in the background. It was close, very close. I took a step back, my heart racing. The beam of light caught something, a shape barely visible between the trees. Figure maybe 10 yards away. I didn't move. I just stood there, holding my breath, staring at the shape. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, watching. For a long moment, I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to shout out, run, do something, but my body stayed frozen, like it was waiting for the right moment to act. And then the figure moved. It didn't run. It didn't lunge at me. It just turned and walked slowly into the woods, disappearing behind the thick trees. I waited a few seconds before I let out a shaky breath. I had no idea what I'd just seen. Person? A shadow? A trick of the light? I didn't want to stick around to find out. I hurried back to the fire, grabbed my pack, and shoved everything into the truck. My hands shook, but I forced myself to focus. I had to leave. I didn't know who or what that was, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going to stay and find out. I slammed the truck door shut, my heart still pounding. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, but I didn't dare look back as I drove down the narrow road, faster than I had come in. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following me, but there was nothing, just the empty road behind me. The further I drove, the more I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. But the feeling, the unease, the cold sweat, stayed with me, gnawing at my thoughts. By the time I hit the main road and the trees started to thin out, I was exhausted. My hands were still tight on the steering wheel, and I couldn't shake the image of the figure in the woods. I tried to tell myself it was just some other camper or hiker, maybe someone lost. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I didn't sleep that night. Couldn't. I kept replaying the whole thing over and over in my head. The footsteps, the figure, the feeling that something was watching me. When I got home, I found a message on my phone. It was from a friend who lived nearby. "Hey, I know this is random, but I was out in the woods near your spot earlier today. Heard something strange. Thought you might want to know." It was followed by a video. The video was shaky, but clear enough to make out what was in it. Someone know something moving through the trees, and then the figure turned toward the camera. His face was hidden in shadow, but I could tell it wasn't human. I didn't need to watch anymore. That night, I locked all the doors, checked every window, and sat in silence. Whatever had been out there, whoever had been out there, I would never be going back.